Welcome to the J3U University podcast. I'm your host, John Jewett.
And I'm your co-host, Luke Miller.
Our mission is to elevate the physique coaching standard
and deliver the highest level of competitors to the stage.
Let's jump into today's episode. Building muscle off cycle. I know that sounds like a complete oxymoron, but we have a lot of people that are making this transition now from off season into contest prep, or maybe from an off season growth phase into another off season growth phase. But there needs to be this transition period that's going to take place. Am I just pulling you in with saying off cycle or cruising or a hold phase? But this phase can really set the stage for what your total projection of muscle accrual is going to be, and leading that into your prep or your next off-season push. Luke and I are going to discuss it today.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of names for this. Like, you'll see different coaches call it different things, whether it's hold phase, transition phase, prep transition, whatever, health phase for some people. I think really the thing is like assessing what does the athlete need in order to retain the tissue that was built in the last phase. Are there any habits that need to be implemented for the phase that's coming? And then use this as a way to maintain training performance, kind of fix any issues that may have cropped up, but also kind of start to develop the athlete and the habits that need to move in that right direction. Because I think one of the quickest things that you can see in athletes who don't make the most progress is they get sloppy in their execution when the compounds start to drop off. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, no, definitely. And, with moving into, and let's be real, like no one's really coming off cycle in this phase, but it is just back to a baseline of what's going to hold tissue. And that's what we've always called it, a holding phase. It's about holding the tissue and then correcting the issue if there was some that cropped up in your push phase, and hopefully we stop the push phase from moving on before you get issues. But that shift in hormonal environment can influence a lot of people of how they want to execute the phase, which is the problem of when you're really going to not be holding on to that tissue. And this really is like the hold phase, transition phase is where you can really solidify the tissue. And I don't mean in an actual literal sense, but if your training input is dropping off because of probably the mental aspect, or you're just poorly managing variables that was kind of masked in your push phase, that's when you won't be holding on to the tissue and we quote unquote solidifying it to a degree. So, making sure like when we are moving into this holding phase that we do set the environment and variables up in a productive way to where we can get the most out of just being on a lower gear amount. And so I think a lot of things need to be set from when you're in this push phase of probably athlete expectations.
Yeah. And
they should really already be in place, right? I mean, that's the reality of it. But for a lot of people, that might not be the case. I see this as having to be even a stricter phase because you're not going to have the hormonal environment to partition as strongly towards muscle and also a little bit more towards body fat, and you're going to have your just overall recovery drop down to a degree. So there's some reactive and proactive things in coaching that do need to take place. But Luke, I think a good place to start is like probably the mental side and expectation side. Like, what are your kind of focal points there?
Yeah, I think that's why in the initial portion, I try to shift people into very process-oriented stuff, like talking about if there's habits that need to be implemented in the next phase. Because in an off-season phase, we can get very performance-driven and like psychologically driven by that performance, especially when we start to see large increases. And I do like the idea of like slowly transitioning into this. So like if you've taken the level 1 course, we talk about rates of gain in all season push phases. And that's like a discussion of an average across the entire push, right? It doesn't mean every week is that percentage of rate of gain. A lot of times with athletes that I'll have, like as they start to phase out of off season into this holding phase, I'm letting that rate of gain drop so that I'm already starting to find like a little bit of stability from a weight perspective at the back end of that push. And we kind of transition into that hold phase pretty well. And oftentimes those last few check-ins will be about dotting our I's and crossing our T's with our habits, making sure that we haven't like letting into the slip, because that margin of error is so tiny in the hold phase. And then also some expectations of understanding progressions will probably be slower. I'll probably have to drop off some volume, potentially depending on how recovery capacity holds. But mentally just preparing someone that progress is probably going to be slower, especially for your bigger, stronger athletes. And it's something that it means that the execution and your ability to execute has to be at an even higher level for this to transition into the following phase. And honestly, when this hold phase or transition phase goes into a prep, so it's like the end of off season, hold phase or transition into a prep, the way someone executes that transition phase can tell you a lot about how that prep is about to go. For my athletes, I tend to see that trend at least.
Yeah, the mental side can be tough because, you know, and even before it's even happened, I think people have a bit of a reactive response to gear coming down that it's not as motivating to go train. It's like, I can't make progress right now. And I think that's looking very short-sighted at what this phase is, because your true progress is over all phases, accumulative over your entire course of bodybuilding, right? So this phase is just as important as the next, even though your potential like rate of ability to increase tissue is going to be a lot lower, or for some it just is at maintenance. But I just keep in mind that if you're on 2 grams of gear per week and you're coming down over the next 4 to 5 weeks, you're still going to be super physiological. So for some people, that is absolutely, I still see progress keep moving along. But in those individuals, what really sets the stage is like the expectation of what you need to be doing in training shouldn't be changing. So the mental side to go in the gym and execute your lifts the same and the effort the same, I think is a big one. Some people just lose some of that mental drive because those androgens aren't there to drive that sympathetic nervous system as much. And you don't feel as full either. Pumps aren't going to be as amazing. So you have this perception that your workouts aren't as good. And you just need to realize that's par for the course. And you might feel a little softer in this phase too. And visually, when I see these athletes, they're like, man, I feel flat. And, you know, and then you look at them, you're like, man, you barely look any different. You truly do. I think the perception's a lot different than the reality of it. And some guys will start looking like, oh man, I'm dropping off size really quick. And when you look at how training performance is, it's like, if you're holding that well, that's really our best proxy that you're not going to lose the actual tissue, contractile tissue that you gained in that push phase. So execution of training is the big thing that needs to be the expectation set moving into this next phase. Like it should be a smooth transition, nothing changes, but the reality is it does change for some guys. And so that's something just to really, I think, look out for, and also know like, hey, you're supposed to feel not as full and pumped up, and that's going to be pretty normal for this phase. I think another expectation to be set moving into this phase is outside of, you know, the mental side of like, what do we actually need to make corrections to, if there is some, and preparing for the phase that jumps after the hold phase. Because usually push phases in for a few reasons. Some, maybe everything went perfectly. It just is about to hit into a prep timeline. And we just need a phase of like lower gear, dropping some stress down before we accrue a lot of stress across contest prep. But other things are like, hey, you accrued a lot of body fat. Health markers are maybe getting a little skewed. Blood pressure is a little high. We see like lipids are probably not where they should be. And we just know that trajectory is not going to keep going in a positive way. It's only going to get worse. Or a lot of issues are like guys just hit the wall with appetite and digestion and just cannot keep sustaining the rate of surplus that needs to happen. Those are 3 kind of main big ones that run into.
Yep.
And so if those were the issues running in the push phase, the hold phase, it's not just about holding tissue, it's also about correcting those issues. So some expectations there is that, hey, we need to have these be focal points. So when we get to our next phase, that we are able to make the corrections and then be productive again, whether it be in fat loss or into another extended push phase. So depending on what that was, kind of dictates also what the hold phase should really look at, right? Because it could be like you say, Luke, for some guys, you're just kind of lowering the surplus down and then they just kind of transition into maintenance into that phase. While some guys might need more of a drop because of food appetite being problematic or body fat being problematic. Thanks everyone for tuning in to today's podcast. Are you struggling to hit your peak on show day? Feeling lost in the off season? Upgrade your coaching game with J3 University. Our program covers everything from off season to contest prep to peak week, all based from real client results. Along with our comprehensive physique curriculum, you'll also get access to our 4 rooms with our J3U team to answer any questions you have and live Q&A sessions to further your coaching and athlete experience. We are the source of education for top IFBB pros and coaches. Join us to elevate the coaching standard at J3 University. Let's get back to today's podcast.
Yeah, and I think, arguably, that's probably the more common one, right? Like, it's probably more common to see off the back of an off-season push that there needs to be some sort of drop in order to set themselves up for the next phase, whether it's GI just can't handle the food load anymore, and it's not like a body fat percentage issue. It's just building more room for being able to grow in that following phase for like the extremely high metabolism into the bell curve, or like just tidying up so that you have room to run another push. It's going to transition into that. And I don't know about you, but when I go into this hold phase, like I do find that there is some sort of food drop kind of initially off the cut. Like even if like we're not wanting weight to drop a ton, like if we haven't found weight stability and we've seen that weight kind of go up towards the back end, most of the time heading into the back end of that phase, it's either food drop, or if they've let cardiovascular activity slip, it's like getting that activity metrics plugged back in so that we kind of have them moving in that direction of maintenance to slight deficit. And I will say that most of the time I'm looking to improve nutrient partitioning, improve insulin sensitivity, potentially improve body composition, and start to kind of bring in the reins quite a bit through that in-between phase. It's kind of how I'd say a large percentage of clientele are going to have to run these hold phases. It's like a week to 3 weeks of holding, kind of transitioning into deficit for a lot of them.
I know a lot of people, maybe you're in your final weeks of your push phase right now. You're thinking, I'm good. I can keep going. And it's those guys that you shouldn't probably keep going till there's a problem.
Yeah.
That's not what you're aiming for. I think a lot of people, you do a lot of things around that. Like, hey, I'm using Tren. I don't have any sleep issues. Like, or you just keep using it to make sure like there is an issue present, right? Like my hands aren't numb using growth hormone. Like it must not be working. It's like, you shouldn't be chasing the negative effects. But I saw a great analogy, credit to Joe Jeffrey. He's the one that said it. It's like, if you throw a frog into boiling water, he'll jump out. If you put him in there and slowly crank up the heat, he'll stay in and just get, boiled alive. Why is Joe cooking frogs? I don't know. But to the point is that in an off-season push phase, it's very similar to the frog just slowly getting boiled.
Yeah.
You just keep accruing this damage and stress to your system to where you're by the end, you don't really realize how bad you actually do feel and how much better you could feel. I just had a client situation where I could see all the signs of this was just negative. Like digestion was really poor. Just looking at the individual, they're holding a ton of water and they wanted to keep pushing. There was time left to keep pushing, right? The timeline was okay, but it's like, there's been a long time on cycle. I don't think we realize how poor this really is in the environment. So gear came down, food came down, like 10 pounds off in a week, drastically different physique, right? And then sleep's better, digestion's better. Like these are like immediate turnarounds. He's like, whoa, I had no idea this is like how I even felt. It's like, yeah, it's just like the slow accrual that happens and why we do need these phases to occur. So just an example of like I just want to quickly turn someone around and get productive. And once I see that, then I can bring some food back up. So for some individuals, it's as simple as that, of just making that transition like that into a hold phase. Some guys, it's more like body fat related, and you could pull some fat off pretty quick, like even while gear's coming down the first few weeks. And then once you're reaching that kind of 4-week mark, then you bring food back up and you maintain weight into your next push phase. And for a lot of guys, usually those are guys coming to us that are brand new, that probably have just let body fat still get too high. And even 4 weeks into a hold phase isn't going to be enough time. Then we start the cut on the beginning of the fat loss phase, or the front end of the push phase next time. So just to account for all that. So, but point being here is like, what is your issue to end the push? See if you can correct some of that on the front end of the hold phase. If not, then that might extend into your next push-up phase, or it might be extending into your hold phase. But I think we need to keep like the ultimate goal in mind. And like my Cairo says, keep the goal. So the goal in bodybuilding is keep building muscle and maintain body composition, right? To a degree. So we always still want that to be the main priority in our hold phase. And if we are getting to points where we're removing us from that goal, we probably need to rethink our entire planning. Would that be like, hey, the last push phase, like where do we really go wrong here? Like cropped up a ton of injuries to now this hold phase is now more of a rehab phase. It's like, okay, the goal is no longer the goal. We're not building muscle anymore. We're becoming like a rehab case. So we need to address those issues. We're noticing your hold phase needing to extend really long and not being able to move into your changes from there. But Luke, let me throw it back to you, because getting a little touch into training.
Yeah.
What type of transition should be making on the training side with the case of not being injured?
Yeah. With assuming no injury profiles are present. It's an interesting training period. A lot of people tend to want to tinker pretty quickly. Like they've been training on the same training program for a pretty long time. And it's something that they're excited for a new program or something along those lines. I do find straight off the cuff that introducing new program design is probably not the move. You're wanting to maintain performance to retain the tissue for as long as possible. So I'd rather go the route of running a deload if it's needed to maintain performance, keep a lot of the movements similar, drop the volume to match the dropping of the recovery capacity that's coming, and then a little bit closer to the following phase. So when you're at the end of the hold phase or the mini cut, then you're looking at potentially new program design, new patterns, because you've progressively titrated that volume or total stimulus down to keep the quality of the stimulus high. You probably reach the rock bottom of volume by the end of that phase, that you're kind of in a place where you can start to make movement swaps if movement swaps are needed. And I think that's a place where if I'm going to raise a red flag of the beginning of a hold, it's wanting to pivot programs so fast because you ended the push. I don't think it's probably the best way to have your training be productive for tissue retention. I think that's probably the biggest takeaway that you could probably take from what needs to happen training wise, in my opinion.
When you said deload, do you like your deload right before you drop gear, or drop gear and deload at the same time? Or does it not matter to you?
Doesn't matter. I mean, serum levels are going to be dropping, but compounds are probably so high that if it's the week before I drop them or the week after I drop them, the difference in that athlete's probably not too much different. It's more, I'm subjectively watching these metrics and I'm probably pulling the plug on the all season when the deload's coming, more than likely, because those metrics tend to line up pretty well. Some of the other metrics that I'm concerned about that are non-training related alongside some of the training fatigue tend to kind of align towards that back end of the push. So I'll drop the compounds when I start that deload and then roll.
Yeah, I think you brought up a good point here, is to not just throw in a deload because you should throw in a deload. It's what does a deload do? Why do you use it? Do you fit that criteria to use the deload at that moment? Then you do the deload. You don't just assume because gear's coming down or something, you should just go ahead and deload, right? There's situations where I don't deload because that wasn't the problem.
Yep.
100%. So doesn't always need to happen. For a lot of guys, it could be a little bit, I've done some things just proactively of like taking some extra rest days off because they could just keep training, but just with the long durations of training in mind ahead. And also some of these guys, the way they would describe their training fatigue is more in favor to they psychologically want to keep training. So as a protective aspect for them, it's not going to hurt them to do a little bit of a deloading. If anything, help them to just keep sustaining that ability to train. So whether that is the week of or the week after, I think more just assessing where the athlete is from a training fatigue standpoint is probably what is more the case. You brought up around like not making vast changes to training. I guess my case would be if you've gone to a vast specialization within the push phase, and you are transitioning pretty far down into a recovery state that's going to be lessened, right? So less food, less gear, maybe even cutting some body fat off, that you should probably transition back from that specialization phase more to your overall balanced type programming. So that's like minor transitions. We're not talking like what should be my new training split be? It's like, no, we're just like pulling a few things out that maybe got some extra priority. Like for instance, for myself, right? I threw a bit of chest and delt work on my leg day for some extra frequency and volume there. And like, I just might pull that out. I still have my 2 push days per week. I've also made the very simple case. If you don't know what to do in your hold phase, an easy way to kind of regulate recovery is just take your split, do the exact same thing and add in a rest day. Just spread out the frequency. Because usually within the session is not a problem once you're off gear. I find it's the frequency that really becomes the problem because connective tissue just doesn't have the same recovery capacity like when you're on cycle. So.
Yeah, I'm glad you made that clarification because in my head, when I was saying volume adjustments for specialized program design, those volume adjustments are directly towards the specialized body parts. Right, there's a higher percentage of volume drops for the specialized body part typically because of the amount of work you're doing relative to some of the other sessions. So I do think it's important. I do think kind of like transitioning out of training into potentially like the next topic to discuss is one of the things that I think can happen, especially the more advanced that you get, is when you're pulling someone out of specialization, right? You drop the program design, you bring the volume down. Potentially you've got some problems to fix. There is such a case as doing a hold phase for too long. And I think that's like a topic that needs to be discussed because when you're pursuing the highest levels of competing, your efficiency across long-term is determined on how well you transition in and out of phases, which is where we made the acute comment of like, the execution needs to be really tight here so that we don't accrue body fat too high or we don't lose tissue that we've accumulated in the previous phase. And I think a lot of the times some of these phases can get extended because the execution is dropped or they don't execute at the same level. So to achieve the amount of change in the hold phase or mini cut, if there is like a body composition improvement, takes a little bit longer than you would expect it. And you end up getting to a point where the time at the lower compound load is too long for maximizing the ability for someone to progress over the long term.
Yeah. And to that point, this is why you're trying to really clip the push phase before those problems do arise. Because if you're running into more of a fixer-upper in your hold phase, that's when you're going to be suboptimal in a lot of areas to keep holding tissue. And you're going to see a drop off potentially a lot faster than the guy that was very well managed his push phase. We ended at an appropriate time and he can just kind of just seamlessly move into a hold phase. And you'll have, you could extend that phase as long as whatever would be needed there. But once you move up to a high enough level, it's not a sustainable amount of muscle anymore to where you do start to lose some. And usually I find some guys in that 6 to 8 week period, when compounds come down, which if you really think about it, it's probably only 2 to 3 weeks of getting to a baseline amount, is when you really see shifts start changing in the physique to where you're starting to backpedal, and you'd have to make that up on the next push phase. And for a guy that needs to just keep moving forward to compete at the level he wants to, we just can't allow that to happen. And that's kind of the reality of the guy on a higher risk type of setup. And when we see that kind of decline, again, keep the goal, right? If we're moving away from like progressing physique, it might be just time to push back up. So that's the gray area of like, when is that right? When is it not?
Yeah.
So we just kind of look at the overall picture, make sure we're monitoring health markers efficiently. The guy that is in that type of risk profile, doing all the things that you need to be doing to, protect yourself as well.
I think just to point this out, like, this is why we stress so much of off seasons having contest prep based habits, because if you let yourself slip to the point that you accumulate health issues, body fat too high, whatever it is in the off season that doesn't go the way that it should have been had you executed at that level, it's not only potentially ending that phase in a place that you shouldn't be, but it's also extending that hold phase after. And it's preventing our job of being able to keep you moving forward the entire time, because we now have problems to fix in the hold phase that wouldn't have been there had the execution been there. So it's like, when in doubt, like, just look at the way you execute your process and try to execute it at the highest standard that you can, because it's always going to pay off in the long term. It's going to allow your hold phases to be as short and efficient as possible. It's going to allow you to transition out of that off-season phase seamlessly. It's going to allow you to transition to the following phase seamlessly. So a lot of it comes back to how well it's executed. And I don't want to belabor a point, but it's like, hold phases that go too long or mini cuts that go too long are often a product of the previous phase not being done the way it should have been.
This rewinds back to what you do the first week after your show, like, sets the stage for all of these phases ahead, right?
Amen.
You nearly rewind all the way back to that point, because some guy that I've seen screwed up that first week, it's not just a week of screwing that up. It really is months of making a suboptimal process, and it really does set up your next contest prep and what you're going to bring on stage. So if you can transition even from your last prep into the post show, into your off season, into the whole phase, all like you were executing on prep, there's flexibility within off season. Not saying that, but the routine like structure and narrowing your variables and being consistent in those areas will make all these phases so much more seamless, productive, to where you will have the most tissue accrual and physique change possible across a true off season. And you won't be spending so much of your off season, your hold phases, in fixing issues, cleaning up body fat. It'll be actually what it's meant to be doing, is improving, which I think it's a great time just to kind of end on that point, because I think, as Luke pointed out, it's the most important point to make out of this. And it's the hardest one to do. And I do think it takes years to develop that and the experience to even do it. And for a lot of people, just kind of revealing layers of the next level that you can be executing at. Sometimes you're just completely naive that even was a thing in certain areas that you could be doing. But anyway, with this off cycle, quote unquote, hold phase, it's not downtime. It's nearly never downtime. This is still an investment in your long-term progress. Set clear objectives for what you're doing within this phase. Execute it like it is your prep. Stay stricter in this phase because the hormones aren't present to partition in your favor. And this will just make the next push even better for you, or the next prep even better for you. Thank you all for tuning in, and we will talk to you next time.